I fell into the water along with Alice, George's first love. Instead of helping me, George let me go, choosing to save her. Dragging my injured leg, I crawled to shore and demanded a divorce. George looked utterly baffled. Alice can't swim, he said defensively. Why are you overreacting? Our 5-year-old son stared at me with the same indifferent gaze. Mom, you're fine, aren't you? Do you really need to make such a big deal? Enraged, I slapped George across the face and pinched our son's cheek with a cold smile. Oh, trust me, I'm making a scene. George's head snapped to the side, and when he turned back, a flicker of anger crossed his lips. Scarlett, can you calm down? He snapped. Henry, too young to grasp what was happening, began crying and squirming in my arms. Wow! Dad saved Aunt Alice and not you. You're so mean. You deserve to fall in the water, Henry wailed. With my aching leg, I landed a sharp smack on his backside. Go ask Alice to be your mother, I retorted. Alice stepped forward, gently pushing me aside and scooping Henry into her arms. Her expression was full of wounded sympathy, but when her eyes met mine, she wore a smug, barely disguised smile. Scarlett, he's just a child, she said softly. He doesn't mean it. How could you hit him? Henry clung to Alice, his small voice breaking with fury. I'm not just mad. I don't want her to be my mom. She's useless. Can't ride horses. Can't play golf. Aunt Alice is way better. Dad doesn't even like her, and neither do I. Before he could go on, George's sharp voice cut through the air. Henry, enough! He stepped between us, shielding Alice and Henry protectively, creating a perfect picture of a family. A crying son, a gentle mother, and a towering father. Alice, her tone dripping with mock innocence, added, Oh, Henry is such a sweet boy. So wise for his age. I don't think I'd have the heart to hit him if I were his mom. My lips curled into a frozen smile as I fixed my gaze on Alice. Say one more word, and you'll be next, I warned. Her smirk faltered, freezing in place. I scoffed and walked away, leaving the pathetic trio, the cheating man, the shameless woman, and my foolish son, there on the beach. The next day, I handed George the divorce papers. He furrowed his brow, adjusting his gold-rimmed glasses with a tired expression. Scarlett, this is too much. Don't you think you're taking it too far? He asked, exasperated. This isn't a tantrum, I replied coldly. Just sign the papers. Assets are split per the prenup, and Henry's custody goes to you. Henry had inherited George's indifference, cruelty, and lack of love for me. Rather than keeping him, I thought it better to let him stay with George. George placed the papers on the table, studying me with confusion etched into his face. All because of yesterday? Alice can't swim. What was I supposed to do? You were fine. Does this really have to end in divorce? He clung to the events of the previous day, using them as justification, as if it made his actions excusable. Because I hadn't drowned. The day before, we had gone to the beach with Henry. At one point, George stepped away briefly and returned with Alice. He claimed he had run into her by chance and invited her along so she wouldn't be lonely. Watching Henry run into Alice's arms, crying, Aunt Alice, I missed you so much. It's only been a day, made me realize they had been in touch all along. George had even taken Henry to see her multiple times. His guilty expression and the weak explanation he offered only confirmed my suspicions. Later, when a wave crashed into Alice and me, pinning us underwater, George acted without hesitation. He chose to save her. There was no rising tide, and the waves weren't strong enough to carry us out to sea. It felt as if the ocean itself had set a test. And George made his decision. He forgot I was his wife, forgot my injured leg, the very injury I got saving his life once, and abandoned me without a second thought. And now, he asked if it was worth ending our marriage over. Of course it was worth it. They may not love me, but I have to love myself. I looked him directly in the eyes and said with measured calm, What if I couldn't make it out of the water, George? What if, with this lame leg, I drowned? The only reason I'm standing here asking for a divorce is because I survived. George opened his mouth, speaking before he thought. But you're still alive, he began, trailing off as he realized how callous it sounded. He looked away, inhaling deeply. His tone carried a subtle warning. If you leave me, you'll have no parents, no family. Where will you go? I smiled faintly, pushing the papers closer. That's not your concern. Consider it repayment for the life I saved. George's face darkened. He hated it when I brought up that debt, and still seemed convinced I wouldn't leave him without taking Henry. All you ever talk about is saving my life, he said coldly. Don't think I'll let you come crawling back so easily. Take some time to think this through. In the end, I got what I wanted. The divorce certificate. Returning to the house we had shared for 7 years, I began packing my belongings. The house was filled with elegant, expensive items, but what truly belonged to me amounted to only a few scattered possessions. Finally, I retrieved my painting easel from the attic, slung it over my shoulder, and left. As I reached the garden gate, I looked up and saw Henry standing on the second-floor balcony. His lips were pressed into a thin line, his small face as cold as ice. He stood silently, likely hoping I would comfort him, kiss him, or apologize. I paused and called out softly, "Eat well and sleep well, Henry. Mom won't be around anymore, so take care of yourself." His eyes reddened, but he turned his head with a cold snort. "Go if you want. Aunt Alice will take care of me now. I don't need you." I said nothing more. In the fading light of the setting sun, I walked away from the villa, with my easel on my back. Henry hadn't always been like this. Before Alice returned, he was a sweet and considerate child. When his friends teased him about me not knowing how to ride horses or play golf, he would defend me fiercely. So what if she can't? She's my mom, and all she has to do is love me. But after Alice returned from abroad, George started taking Henry to see her. He became a different child. He resented me, refusing to let me pick him up from preschool, or asking me to leave when his friends came over. Even on the anniversary of my parents' death, when I broke down crying, Henry looked at me coldly and told me I wasn't graceful. Looking back now, I see how alike he and George truly are. They love the same people and hate the same people. They both love Alice, and they both hate me. The path out of the villa community wasn't long, but it took me 7 years to walk it. As the small road bathed in evening light stretched before me, my mind drifted to the past. 15 years ago, my father had died saving George's father. My mother, overcome with grief, passed away shortly after. I was passed from one place to another until I eventually ended up at George's house. George was the sole heir to a highly respected family, a privileged young master who, even during his youth, treated me with kindness. Because of that, I foolishly fell in love with him. But everything changed when he met Alice and fell for her instead. As they began dating, I buried my feelings deep inside. Even when they eventually broke up, I no longer dared to hope for anything. However, after I saved George during an accident, everything shifted. With his parents' approval, he began to pursue me earnestly. He courted me persistently, and I couldn't harden my heart against the man I had loved for so many years. Eventually, I gave in to his efforts, and we got married. When I gave birth to Henry, I thought we had built a life together that would last forever. But Alice's return shattered that dream entirely. 3 months ago, I went to pick up a drunk George outside a lounge. As I approached, I overheard his friends talking about Alice. "Alice is back in town," one of them said. "What are you going to do?" George, leaning against the table with a glass of red wine in his hand, swirled the liquid and gave a helpless smile. "What can I do? I'm already married," he replied. His friends weren't ready to let it go. "But what if you weren't married? You loved her so much you almost died for her," one of them teased. George forced a laugh and replied, "You're talking nonsense." Another friend added, "Oh, I forgot. It was your wife who saved you and ended up with a limp. You owe her for that, don't you? You can't betray her now." Hearing George's bitter smile and the teasing remarks cut through me like a knife. I froze in place, unable to move. At that moment, I realized something devastating. George had never loved me. All he felt was guilt. For 7 years, I had been caught in a web of lies. But it wasn't too late to escape. Bathed in the glow of the evening sun, I finally felt free. That night, I moved into a hotel I had reserved in advance. Later that evening, George's parents called me, unaware of our divorce. Their warm and familiar voices asked when I would bring Henry to the family home for dinner. Thinking of George's father's high blood pressure, I bit back the truth about our separation. Instead, I gave a simple excuse, saying I was busy for the time being. After hanging up, I sent George a text. "Your parents called, asking when I'd bring Henry home for dinner. I covered for you this time, but you should tell them about the divorce soon." Hours later, he replied with a short message. Understood. I had done everything I could. From that moment onward, there was nothing left tying me to George. With a sense of finality, I blocked his number and decided to move on. Alone in the quiet of the night, I ran my fingers over the worn artboard I had brought from the villa. Memories of my childhood dreams washed over me, dreams I had once cherished while nestled in my parents' arms. "When I grow up, I want to be a great artist," I had told them. They would smile warmly, pat my head, and reply, "Yes, our little Scarlett will be the greatest artist in the world." But when I moved into George's house, I abandoned my passion for painting. His parents made their preferences clear from the start. "Scarlett, wouldn't studying something else be more practical?" "George is studying it too," they had suggested. Young and naive, I let their words guide me onto a path that wasn't mine. Blinded by their approval, I gave up my dreams and followed a road that didn't belong to me. Now, as I stared at the paint-stained board, yellowed with time, it felt like a remnant of the life I had left behind. Though I tried scrubbing it, the marks would never completely fade. But over the years, the stains became less noticeable, and as I focused on the brighter areas, I finally smiled. I placed fresh paper on the board and retrieved the brushes I had purchased at dusk. Just as the tip of the brush touched the paper, my phone rang, shattering the silence. The number was familiar. It was George's assistant, Jacob. "Ma'am, George had a bit too much to drink at a work event. He's asking for you. Could you come pick him up?" he asked politely. Jacob had grown used to calling me whenever George drank too much. But now the situation was different. George and I were divorced. Setting my brush down, I replied softly but firmly, "I can't. George and I aren't together anymore. Please don't call me for this again." I heard a sudden crash in the background. Hesitating, I added, "Check his phone. Look for a contact named Alice. She's a far better choice to pick him up." Just as I was about to hang up, George's hoarse voice broke through the line. Anger laced his words as he growled, "Scarlett, are you really leaving me like this?" For a brief moment, I thought I had imagined it. After all, it took a special kind of audacity for a man who cheated on me to play the victim. Letting out a quiet laugh, I calmly said goodbye to Jacob and ended the call. Returning to my brush, I channeled all the turbulence in my heart into my art. I stayed up late that night, so when my phone rang early the next morning, I answered with irritation. "Who calls this early?" I grumbled. On the other end was Bonnie, the housekeeper from the villa. Her voice was cautious as she said, "Scarlett, Henry isn't feeling well. George left early this morning, and I can't reach him. Could you come check on him?" The mention of Henry being unwell gripped my heart with worry. What mother can stay calm when her child is sick, even if that child no longer loves her? For a moment, I froze. Then I quickly replied, "I'll come right away." When I arrived, I found Henry lying alone in his room. My chest tightened as I rushed to his bedside, reaching out to feel his forehead. "Are you feeling unwell?" I asked gently. At the sight of me, Henry's eyes reddened, and for a brief moment, his expression softened. But just as quickly, he swatted my hand away, turned his back to me, and pulled the blanket over his head. His muffled voice came through. "You left. Why are you back? You shouldn't have come." Henry rarely fell ill, and seeing him so vulnerable dissolved the walls I had tried so hard to build. Sitting on the edge of the bed, I gently pulled the blanket down so he could breathe more easily. His flushed face, red from fever, and swollen eyes filled with unshed tears made me freeze. Regret flooded over me. He was only 5 years old. What could he possibly understand? His anger at me and attachment to Alice were the result of George's influence. He was just a child, shaped by the people around him. Why had I let myself take it all so personally? The more I thought about it, the more guilt consumed me. My voice trembled as I whispered, "Henry, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have left you. I was wrong to give you up." Henry was still very young, and I told myself there might still be a chance to mend things. My voice grew firmer as I bent down and gently pulled him into a hug. "Henry, come with me, okay? I'll talk to your father again about custody." For a fleeting moment, I felt Henry relax slightly in my arms, even nuzzling against me like he used to. It felt as though my sweet and caring boy had returned. He clung to me for a while before finally speaking, his voice soft but unwavering. "Don't bother. You won't get custody of me." I stroked his hair, my tone resolute. "I'll trade my share of the assets for you." Henry pulled away, his red, tearful eyes staring into mine. In a voice that was both innocent and painfully cruel, he said, "Mom, don't be stupid. With Dad, I have Aunt Alice to take care of me. I get fancy cars, the best schools, and everything I want. With you, you can't give me any of that. And besides, Dad won't let you take me. If you try, you won't even make it out of this house." His words left me speechless, caught in my throat as I struggled to respond. I stammered, "I'll keep trying. I'll find a way to talk to him." But Henry's expression turned cold, cutting off my weak attempt. "Mom, I'm not going with you. You don't belong here anymore. Aunt Alice came back, and you should have stepped aside for her. Just leave and don't come back. I don't want to see you again. Aunt Alice will be my mom now." I had heard these words before, but they pierced me as sharply as ever. Tears flowed down my face as I looked at the boy I had carried and brought into this world. Henry turned away from me, raising a small hand and pointing toward the door. "Leave. I don't want to see you anymore." I stood there, motionless, unable to move. Then, with a sudden crash, he threw a cup to the floor near my feet. The porcelain shattered loudly, and a sharp shard grazed my ankle, leaving a thin line of blood. As I felt the sting, clarity hit me like a wave. The regret I had felt when I entered the room was misplaced. Henry wasn't simply mirroring George's influence. This coldness, this indifference, was a part of him. He didn't love me, and perhaps he never had. I stepped back, my feet moving on their own as I turned to leave. At the doorway, I stopped, unable to resist looking back one last time. "Henry, if I leave now, I really won't come back." His response was another cup hurled at the floor, shattering into pieces. I wiped the tears from my face and left without looking back. Outside his room, I ran into Bonnie, the housekeeper. She looked at me with concern, her gaze flickering toward Henry's door. "Did Henry upset you again?" she asked hesitantly. I shook my head, my voice soft as I replied, "No, I upset him. And Bonnie, please don't call me about him anymore. He doesn't want to see me." Bonnie watched me leave, and I thought I heard her muttering under her breath, "He couldn't possibly not love you. He even calls for you in his sleep." Tears welled up in my eyes again, but I wiped them away and shook my head. How could that be true? Henry had told me time and time again that he didn't need me. As I left, familiar streets passed by my window, but they felt strange and distant. My phone vibrated repeatedly with calls from an unknown number. When I finally answered, George's voice came through the line. "Scarlett, Henry is sick. Why didn't you stay with him?" A bitter laugh escaped me as anger bubbled in my chest. "George, isn't this exactly what you wanted? Henry doesn't want me to be his mother anymore. You must be thrilled." George's voice was strained as he tried to explain. "That's not what I meant. I just wanted him to stop disliking Alice." My restraint snapped, and I shouted in anguish, So you made him hate me instead? Is that it? Scarlett, that's not what I wanted, George stammered. I thought if Henry accepted Alice, he wouldn't resent her so much. A cold laugh slipped from my lips as I cut him off. George, why should I accept Alice? She's the one who destroyed our marriage. The silence on the other end stretched so long that I no longer had the energy to argue. I hung up, staring out the window at the blurred trees. Suddenly, I couldn't bear to stay in this city any longer. Clutching my phone tightly, I leaned forward to speak to the driver. Do you take long-distance trips? I want to go to Minnesota. That's where my parents were from. I miss them. After handing in my resignation and packing my belongings from the hotel, I headed to Minnesota. I'll admit it, I was a coward. I feared that if I stayed, I would weaken and end up compromising for Henry's sake, trapping myself in that same endless misery. As a young girl, I had given up my dream of being an artist, all for the sake of silently loving George. For more than a decade, I hadn't touched a paintbrush. Whenever I felt restless, I would take out my old drawing board, only to put it away again, distracted by work or by Henry calling for me. Mom, now that I was divorced, those chains no longer held me. I felt as though I had been reborn. Perhaps I should thank Henry. If he had shown even a little affection, I might still be trapped in that endless abyss. But as things stand, everything has fallen into place. I would take my drawing board with me and slowly rediscover the person I used to be. In Minnesota, I rented a small cottage and began a new life. This life was rich and vibrant, like oil paints on a canvas. My days were filled with sketching outdoors, and I spent my nights reading in the cozy warmth of my little home. Along the way, I made new friends, retired grandparents, students, and other locals. We never planned to meet, but we would often bump into each other while painting the beautiful scenery around us. Green lakes, golden leaves, and sunsets burning with fiery hues. At first, I was self-conscious about my work. Whenever someone walked by, I would try to cover my painting, afraid they might laugh. But the more I painted, the more I overcame my fears. Mistakes didn't scare me anymore. What truly frightened me was the idea of never starting again. Now, no matter how imperfect my work seemed, I would confidently place my canvas on the easel and adjust it stroke by stroke. Today, I was working on an autumn lakeside scene. At first, I wasn't satisfied. The colors felt flat, the composition seemed off, and the elements didn't connect. But I kept at it, carefully reworking each detail. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I stretched my back, sore but relieved, and smiled at the finished piece. Much better than your last one, someone said, surprising me. I looked up to see a group of elderly friends gathered around me, critiquing my work. They teased me about how shy I had been when I first arrived, and praised how much I had improved. Standing in their circle, I smiled to myself and thought, even if I make mistakes, my hands will keep moving, and I'll let my brush guide me toward the results I want. Life is the same. It's about moving forward, no matter how hard it gets. Autumn in Minnesota passed quickly, and before long, snowflakes began to fall. People ventured out less often to paint, and I started working from home instead. To track my progress, I began hosting faceless live streams while I painted. I often chatted to myself as I worked. This color doesn't work. Oh, this one's much better. Wow, this contrast is great. I might be a genius, I joked. Over time, I gained a few hundred followers who would stop by to watch, chat, or simply listen to my monologues as I painted. Usernames became increasingly familiar as I continued streaming, but two stood out above all: Stella and Baby. Stella had joined shortly after I started streaming and was one of my very first followers, while Baby appeared about a month later. I remembered them not only because they were regulars, but also because they were extremely generous with their tips. No matter how much I tried to discourage them, they maintained the top 2 spots on my leaderboard. It also seemed as though they knew each other, as they often bickered in the chat. Stella liked to give advice, often mixing compliments with constructive critiques about my work. Baby, on the other hand, was much more affectionate, always showering me with praise, even when I made mistakes. Their banter could get heated at times. Stella might say, "Baby, do you even know how to paint? Stop being annoying." Baby would respond, "At least I have more than an elementary school education." Stella would fire back, "So much hot air. It's no wonder you're single." Baby wouldn't back down either, sometimes retorting with, "Maybe your mom ran off too." During breaks, I would often scroll through their chat exchanges, shaking my head in amusement at their constant arguing. But despite their quarrels, whenever a troll entered the chat, asking me to show my face or hurling insults, Stella and Baby would immediately join forces to defend me, driving the intruders out together. Streaming had never been about making money for me, so I wasn't especially attached to the chat, but I couldn't help feeling touched by their protectiveness. To thank them, I decided to gift them each one of my favorite paintings. Smiling during a stream, I asked them to send me their addresses. However, when I checked my inbox later, it was silent. Assuming they weren't interested or had left, I decided to send each of them a private message instead. "Thank you so much for all your support. If you don't mind, could you share your address? I'd love to send you a painting I'm particularly proud of." That day, neither of them appeared in the chat, but just as I was about to end the stream, I received their addresses. To my surprise, they were identical, and to make it even stranger, the listed city was the one I had left behind. Staring at their usernames, absurd possibilities started crossing my mind. Then, I couldn't help but laugh. How could they possibly be George and Henry? I thought. One's probably off celebrating his new marriage, while the other is enjoying life with his prestigious new mother. The next day, I ventured out into the swirling snow. I went to the local market to pick up some well-known Minnesota souvenirs, packaged them with the promised paintings, and sent them off. When I returned home, I didn't rest. Instead, I started a live stream and set up my easel. By now, I had begun to suspect that Stella didn't have a regular job. He was always the first to join my streams, greeting me the moment I went live. Baby, in contrast, seemed more like a student, usually arriving later in the evenings. I glanced at the chat and replied to Stella's greeting. "I've sent the paintings. Be sure to let Baby know as well," I said, before turning my attention back to my work. Earlier that day, I had seen a heartwarming moment in the snow. A cheerful father, a mother wearing a red scarf, and their round, bundled-up child holding both their hands as gentle snowflakes fell around them. The sight reminded me of my parents and me from long ago. Inspired, I decided to recreate the scene on canvas as soon as I got home. I was completely absorbed in painting when the doorbell interrupted me. Frowning, I set my brush down and went to answer the door. My neighbor's son stood there, grinning brightly. "Scarlett, I noticed you had a package at the mail station. It's a bag of rice, and it looked heavy, so I thought I'd bring it up for you," he explained. My eyes fell on the bag in his hand, and I suddenly remembered the jasmine rice I'd ordered online a few days earlier. Smiling gratefully, I thanked him and reached out to take it. However, he held onto it enthusiastically. "Where should I put it? I'll carry it to the kitchen for you," he offered. Feeling awkward but touched, I pointed to the kitchen and let him carry it inside. Once he had set it down, I thanked him again and offered him a glass of water. I also insisted he take some fresh fruit I had bought earlier that day as a small token of appreciation. After he left, I returned to my easel. Turned to side. When I glanced at the screen, I noticed an influx of messages from Stella. "Is there a man in your house? Who is he? What's he doing there? What's your relationship with him?" The questions came in rapid succession. Curious, I picked up my phone and saw that Stella had also sent me multiple private messages, each one blunt and demanding. The last one read, "Scarlett, answer me. Who is he?" I blinked at the screen, realization dawning on me. It was suddenly obvious. Stella was George, and Baby was Henry. I didn't respond to his questions, and instead ended the stream abruptly. I couldn't understand what game they were playing. Were they only now starting to realize my value after I had left them? The thought was bitterly ironic. For several days, I avoided streaming entirely. I was glad I hadn't provided my exact address when I sent the paintings. Even if they had some sudden urge to find me, it would take time. Still, I hadn't expected to see them again so soon. After days of staying indoors, I finally decided to step out for some fresh air. But the moment I opened my door, I froze. There they were, George and Henry, standing on my doorstep, staring straight at me. George's hand gripped Henry's tightly, and their gazes didn't waver. After leading them inside and pouring a cup of hot water for Henry, I sat across from George. Watching him take in the small, modest space of my home, I folded my arms and asked coldly, "Why are you here?" Henry sat stiffly on the couch, his small hands gripping a glass tightly, his face blank and expressionless. The tension in the air was palpable, and their shared silence made me scoff internally. After making sure there were no other men in the house, George's demeanor softened slightly, and he raised his eyebrows with an air of false calm. "Scarlett, it's been a while. How have you been?" he asked, his tone unnaturally gentle. I frowned, my irritation bubbling to the surface. Enough with the small talk. Henry's winter break is coming up, and he wanted to see me. Whether he likes me or not, he's still my son, and I'm responsible for his well-being while he's a minor, I said sharply. Turning to Henry, I softened my voice. "Would you like to stay here with me?" I asked gently. Henry took a small sip of the hot water in his glass, his young face tense and strained. Without looking up, he shook his head. "No, Dad made me come," he said flatly. I lowered my eyes, my lips curling into a bitter smile, before I shot George a scornful glance. "Don't use him as an excuse," I said coldly. George's expression darkened, and his voice turned harsh as he turned to Henry. "Henry, show some respect when you speak," he scolded sharply. Unable to stomach his hypocrisy any longer, I let out a cold laugh, cutting him off. "Could you drop the act, at least while you're in my house? And let me remind you, we're divorced. You shouldn't be here bothering me. If Henry wants to visit during his breaks, send someone else to bring him. As for you, I see no reason for us to meet again," I said, my tone biting. George's lips moved, as if to say something, but he hesitated. His shoulders slumped slightly, and he looked almost defeated. "Scarlett, I don't understand. I never cheated on you with Alice. She was always just a friend. What happened at the lake? It was a mistake. There won't be a next time. From now on, I'll put you first. Why do you still want a divorce? You used to love me so much. You even saved my life and hurt your leg. What's changed?" he pleaded. I exhaled slowly, my patience nearly gone, and turned to face him squarely. "Did you marry me because you loved me, George? If you truly loved me, why did you save Alice first, when we both fell into the water? Why did you take Henry to spend time with her behind my back? Why do you keep asking me to accept her? Don't twist the meaning of love like that. It's revolting," I said, my voice low and controlled. George's face paled, but I couldn't hold back any longer. Years of suppressed anger and pain spilled out as I spoke. "George, I did love you when I was younger, but when I risked my life to save you from that car accident, I didn't do it to make you feel indebted to me. I would have done the same for anyone in danger. But what about you? You didn't love me, yet you pretended to, all because you felt guilty. Did you think you were compensating me by marrying me? Do you feel sorry for yourself?" I asked, my voice trembling with restrained fury. George's stunned expression only fueled my anger. "My parents raised me to be kind and selfless, but do you know what? When I realized you married me out of guilt, I regretted saving you. I regretted every bit of it," I said coldly. He looked at me, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. "It's not like that. I love you. I realized it too late," he muttered, his voice faint and unsteady. Taking a deep breath, I pointed to the door. "That doesn't matter anymore. Please, don't come here again," I said, my voice resolute. Henry was the first to move toward the door, his small figure tense as he walked. Just as he reached the threshold, he paused, glancing back at me. His lingering look made my heart ache, and I called out softly, "Henry, would you like to stay with me for a few days?" For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of attachment in his eyes. But his answer came swiftly, firm and cold. "No, I don't stay in small houses," he said. His cutting words shattered any hope I had been holding on to. After they left, I leaned against the door, letting out a heavy sigh. If Henry had chosen to stay, it would have meant more entanglement with George, and if it weren't for their repeated cruelty, I might have remained trapped forever. After that, I moved a few more times, but George always managed to track me down. With his resources, I was practically an open book to him. Eventually, I stopped running and chose instead to ignore him entirely. Whenever he brought Henry over, George would linger shamelessly, following me like a shadow. On walks, he'd trail behind me, lost in his nostalgic ramblings. "Scarlett, do you remember when we used to take walks like this when we were young? It feels just like back then," he would say wistfully. When I painted outdoors with my elderly friends, George would park his car nearby and sit silently, watching. After I finished, he would inevitably bring up the past. "You used to come to my house with a drawing board just like this. I thought you loved painting, but then you stopped. Who would have thought you'd pick it up again all these years later?" he'd remark. My elderly friends would chuckle, teasing, "Scarlett, is that your boyfriend?" I would shake my head firmly and reply, "No, he's my ex-husband, and he's just pestering me." Then I'd explain the story of our divorce, and their faces would fill with indignation. The next time George followed me to an outing, they formed a protective circle around me, keeping him at a distance. Their cold treatment toward him was clear, and their support touched me. "It's all right," I reassured them. "He'll leave soon. Besides, I've already let go." And I was right. George eventually left, called back by business matters. Before leaving, he looked at me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "Once everything settles down, I'll come back for you. I love you," he said earnestly. I smiled faintly, but didn't respond. No matter how many times he returned, I would never go back to him. His so-called love, arriving so late, was like spoiled milk, sour and revolting. He came back a few more times, often bringing Henry with him as part of his attempts to win me over. "Can you really bear to let Henry grow up in a broken home? You love him. Why not give him the best?" he would ask. But George had done too good a job of teaching Henry to reject me. Henry would look up at him, his voice emotionless as he said, "Dad, you can marry Aunt Alice or find someone else to be my mom." When George glared at him in frustration, I couldn't help but feel a cold resolve settle over me. I couldn't stop myself from laughing softly before shutting the door, leaving both George and Henry standing outside. After Henry ruined enough of George's attempts to win me back, George stopped bringing him along. Instead, he began traveling between Minnesota and Chicago on his own, tirelessly repeating his apologies and declarations of love. His words didn't move me, though. At times, I even found them faintly amusing. Eventually, his visits became less and less frequent. By the 5th year, he stopped coming entirely. I had no idea why. Perhaps he'd finally grown tired of the effort. Not that it made any difference to me. By that time, I had made a name for myself as a moderately successful oil painter in my hometown. I had also begun a relationship with a friendly neighbor who had been kind to me during my first winter there. When we decided to get married, Henry made a rare visit. He was 12 years old then, with a maturity that seemed beyond his years. He handed me a bouquet of red roses and looked at me intently. "Mom, I wish you happiness," he said, his tone earnest. Without waiting for a response, he placed the flowers in my hands and turned to leave, never looking back. As I watched him walk away, I felt slightly dazed, holding tightly to my fiancé's hand. "It's been so long since I last saw him," I murmured. "He's grown up so much." My fiancé wrapped an arm around my waist and gently patted my hand. "Yes," he said softly. "Time flies." On the day of my wedding, I saw Henry again. Although I had invited him beforehand, he neither accepted nor declined, so I hadn't expected him to show up. Yet there he was, dressed neatly in a small black suit. As I took my first steps forward in my white gown, he offered me his arm and walked me down the aisle toward my groom. When the moment came for him to place my hand in my new husband's, Henry leaned in close and whispered fiercely in his ear, "Anyone who hurts my mom won't have a good ending. The last one's already in the hospital, so you'd better be careful." My husband, wide-eyed, quickly shook his head and solemnly swore, "I will always love and protect her with my life." I turned to look at Henry, tears welling in my eyes. His face was serious, his eyes red and determined, as though daring anyone to mistreat me. In that moment, I realized that perhaps Henry had never truly hated me. Even during the worst years, maybe he still cared. After all, when he was 5, he had loved me so deeply. Perhaps his way of showing love now was by letting me go. 7 years into my marriage, Alice reappeared in my life. I won't deny that I felt a twinge of hesitation when I saw her. After all, she had once been the love of my youth. But despite those lingering feelings, I had no intention of separating from Scarlett. Then came the day at the lake. When the moment came, my instincts drove me to save Alice first. Scarlett demanded a divorce afterward. For a moment, I panicked, but then I reassured myself. Scarlett had no place else to go. She had loved me for so many years. How could she possibly leave? And then there was Henry, her precious son. Ever since he was born, Scarlett's world had revolved around him. Even I had to step aside. I convinced myself that her anger would fade in time. After all, she wouldn't abandon Henry and me, would she? But I was wrong. This time, Scarlett left for real. She didn't just walk away from me, she left Henry too. One night, desperate and drunk, I called her. "Come pick me up," I begged. I thought enough time had passed for her anger to cool. I hoped this would be the opportunity for her to come back. Instead, she repeated over and over that we were divorced. For the first time, I felt control slipping away. That night, I came home feeling lost. In the living room, I saw Henry playing quietly with the Rubik's Cube Scarlett had given him. When he noticed me, he looked up briefly with a cold glance before lowering his gaze again. An idea came to me then. Late that night, I took Henry's blanket. By morning, just as I had planned, he had caught a cold. I was certain Scarlett wouldn't be able to turn her back on a sick Henry. I asked Bonnie to call her, careful to stay out of sight so I wouldn't anger her further. Before leaving, I told Henry to convince his mom to stay. His fever-flushed face nodded silently. Confident, I left the house, fully expecting Scarlett to come back for Henry and ask to reconcile. But once again, I miscalculated. Scarlett didn't return. Instead, she left the city and went to her parents' hometown. That's when I realized I was on the verge of losing her for good. Later, I hired a private investigator to find her new address. I learned that she had taken up oil painting, built a new circle of friends, and even started live streaming her work. Foolishly optimistic, I thought that perhaps, after some time to herself, she would come back to me. I started watching her streams daily. When Henry discovered what I was doing, he began joining me every evening, sharing the same hope that Scarlett would return. After all, her anger wasn't directed solely at me. If it had been, Henry might have been able to persuade her to stay. I waited patiently, clinging to the hope that she would eventually have a change of heart. But when I heard a young man's voice on her stream one evening, I realized my patience was razor thin. Frustrated and helpless, I demanded to know who the man was and what he meant to her. Scarlett didn't answer. Instead, she abruptly ended the stream. She must have known it was me, but worse, her silence made it clear that she still hadn't forgiven me. I could no longer sit idly by. I booked a flight and brought Henry with me to Minnesota. On the plane, I repeatedly told Henry to ask his mother to return. But Henry only laughed coldly, shaking his head. Irritated, I grabbed his shoulders. "Don't you want your mom to be with you as you grow up?" I demanded. Henry didn't look at me. Instead, he stared out at the clouds, his voice steady and icy. "You never treated her well. I'd rather see her free than trapped here with us." His words froze me in place, anger bubbling beneath my skin. "That's impossible! She belongs to me!" I hissed through clenched teeth. But Henry, unflinching even as a child, glared back. "Let it go. She gave up on you long ago. I won't help you keep her here. When we finally saw Scarlett, Henry stayed true to his word. He didn't try to convince her to return. Instead, he used cutting words to push her even further away. And still, I refused to let her go. Clinging to her as tightly as I could, I begged her not to go. But it was as if I didn't exist. By the 5th year after our divorce, I finally gave up on pursuing her. My health deteriorated, and I fell gravely ill. As I lay bedridden, Henry stood beside me, his gaze sharp, his expression unkind. "You deserve this," he sneered. Struggling to sit up, I stared at him for a long time before speaking. "Did you make her angry on purpose, so she'd have no reason to stay connected to this family?" Henry was only 10, but his maturity was chilling. He glanced at me coldly, his voice as icy as his demeanor. "After that woman came back from abroad, Mom cried herself to sleep so many nights. She'd hold me close and sob after tucking me in. She was torn between leaving you and staying for my sake, because she knew you'd never let her have custody of me. She struggled for so long that she became a shadow of the person she used to be. I loved her, and if she wanted to leave, I was going to make sure she could go without anything holding her back. So yes, I did it on purpose. But wasn't all of it your fault?" I was stunned, unable to respond as I stared at Henry's prematurely hardened expression. Everything began to fall into place. His sudden transformation, the cruelty that had cut Scarlett so deeply. He had always been close to her, always adored her. How could someone else's words have turned him against her? Now I understood it all. He had pushed her away intentionally to give her the freedom to leave. My heart twisted painfully, and I couldn't stop myself from taunting him. "But you lost her in the end." Henry's expression softened into a smile so gentle, it reminded me of the way he used to look at Scarlett. "As long as she's happy, that's all that matters," he said. "Oh, and I have some good news for you. She's getting married soon, and she invited me to the wedding." Before I could fully process his words, the beeping of the monitors around me intensified. A nurse's voice broke through the noise. "His heart rate is irregular. What did you say to upset him? Step outside now. He needs immediate attention." In the chaos, I caught a glimpse of the medical team rushing toward me. Henry, completely unfazed by the commotion, calmly walked out of the room after being scolded. Then everything around me disappeared into darkness and silence. I was swallowed by it, and I regretted everything deeply. If I could go back, I would have saved Scarlett first. Maybe then she wouldn't have left me. My father passed away when I was 15. After his death, with my grandfather's support, I gradually took control of the company. Once I had firmly established my authority, I made my move against Alice's family, the woman who had caused my mother so much misery. Alice came begging for mercy, pleading with me to spare her family for the sake of our past. "What past?" I asked coldly. "The past where you made my mother suffer? The past where you forced me away from her?" Shaking my head, I hit her family even harder. Eventually, Alice's family went bankrupt, and I took over their company. When I learned she was buried under a mountain of debt, I allowed her to stay on as an employee, generously giving her the chance to work off her obligations. To ensure she felt the consequences of her actions, I assigned her former subordinates, the ones she had mistreated, to be her supervisors. But within a few years, Alice couldn't take it anymore. She ended her own life. I barely reacted. How dull, I thought to myself. Learning to manage the company had been excruciating, but I had no choice. If I wanted to protect my mother and ensure her happiness, I had to succeed. In the past, I had pushed her away to give her the freedom she needed to live a better life. Now, I worked tirelessly to secure her happiness and safety. If her current husband ever dares to harm her the way my father did, I'll use every resource I have to shield her. This time, I won't pretend to be indifferent. As a child, I drove her away for her own sake, but now that I'm grown, I'll make sure no one ever hurts her again. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. See you in the next video.